Okay, so it's episode 31, I
Yep,
think
that's right.
we said. Oh, good.
Absolutely. So what are we talking about today?
So I've got a couple of items. I don't know if you've got anything on the list today, but I've got a couple of items.
Um, I
So,
can
I
wing
got.
whatever is on my mind, I guess, but we'll go down your list first. So,
All right, sounds good.
mm,
So the first one I wanted to mention, according to my notes, I haven't mentioned this before. So hopefully my notes are correct there. Lord Lucan. So Lord Lucan was a noble or a peer of the realm in the United Kingdom, and he was accused of murder, and he fled. And that was in 1974, and nobody has heard anything from him since.
okay.
There's really a lot to this story, though. Go
Sure.
on.
Who is Lord Lucan actually exactly?
Right, okay. So, yeah, so he's a British noble. Now, just actually, seventh Earl of Bingham, I think, is his full title. But basically, he was, yeah, so he was an earl in the United Kingdom. He was living in London, and he had become estranged from his wife, and they were in an acrimonious divorce situation. I think actually they may have actually settled the divorce, but they were still quite acrimonious between them. Anyway, or settled the child custody, I should say. Anyway, uh, he, he claims that he was happened to be passing by the house, and I'll get to a moment about how he actually made this claim. But he claims he was actually passing by the house and saw a man inside the house, that is his former house, in a suburb of London called Belgravia. And he saw a man struggling with someone inside the house, and he entered the house. And I think he said the man actually then fled. Anyway, he it transpired that his nanny, Sandra Rivet, was actually murdered. Now, he did say he spoke to his wife, Lady Lucan, when he was in the house, because she had also had been attacked. Now he left the house then, and Lady Lucan came out and went to a local pub and a local hotel and asked them to call the police. And she claimed that Lord Lucan had actually attacked her and the nanny, Sandra Rivet, of course, who was murdered. Now, this seemed to be a pretty open and shut case. It really looked like essentially the case that the police constructed was that he had intended to murder Lady Lucan because of the acrimonious nature of their relationship and everything that was going on. And he had gone into the house and he had somehow mistaken Sandra Rivet for his wife and had accidentally murdered the nanny and then fled. It did in many ways, if you look at it along the surface, it does seem to actually be quite open and shut. But as you dig a little bit deeper, you see there is a little bit more to this. He fled and he actually went and saw some friends of his who were out of London, and he actually called his mother at one point and asked her to go and pick up the children who had slept through the entire thing, by the way. So fortunately, the children weren't involved in any of this. They were all in the house, three of them. His mother came around and picked up the children. He later went to some other friends and he actually wrote a couple of letters to people. And in the letter, this is where he made the claim that he'd seen a man in the house. And he'd fled, of course, and he disappeared that night, and nobody knows what happened to him. Although there have been some suggestions. There've been sightings of him all over the world. There've been sightings of him in Africa, here in Australia. In fact, in Brisbane, not far from me, recently a man claimed that he'd found Lord Lucan as an 80-year-old Buddhist monk living in Brisbane, but that turned out to not be true. But I think one of the particularly interesting things about all this, and I will be going more into this later, I'm writing an article on it. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting is there's obviously been no trial. He's disappeared. They can't convict him of anything so serious ex parte. So they would have to wait for him to turn up for there to be a trial. But they did have an inquiry, and the inquiry named him as the murderer. This was I think it was 1977, they had the inquiry. What's interesting is that there was a bit of outrage over this because it wasn't a trial, it was an inquiry, and they named him as the murderer. And that was the last time that happened in the UK. As a result of that, they actually changed the law so that they can't name someone as a murderer in an inquiry anymore. And it was all because of this case.
Wow.
So yeah. So anyway, what is interesting, I think, is that when you dig a bit deeper, you see that there's bits and pieces that don't quite add up. It turns out that his eldest child actually told his sister, it is the little girl's auntie, that there was a man living in the house, and that sometime he slept in Sandra's bed, and sometimes in Mummy's bed. That's Lady Lucan. So now you've got some independent corroborating evidence there of another man that's in the house, something the police had initially not looked into. But interestingly enough, a statement was taken about this. Interestingly enough, the statement was never submitted into evidence in the inquiry, which I think is quite interesting. Apparently, the police did investigate it insofar as they did look to see whether somebody standing outside could see what Lord Lucan had claimed to be able to see, and they didn't seem to think that he could. But nevertheless, the fact that it wasn't introduced into evidence, I think, is kind of concerning, given that it is corroborating his claim that there was another man in the house. So there's a bit more to this. I have actually discovered, I first looked into this a couple of years ago and thought it was kind of interesting, and there's so much going on, I put it to the side. I recently sort of got back into it, and I'm looking into what happened. I've discovered that a book was written by someone who's absolutely convinced he's not guilty, and I've actually ordered a copy from the UK. It wasn't available online, no Kindle or anything. It was a book written in the 80s, and I've actually got a copy from the UK arriving in a few days. So I'll be reading that book before I proceed with writing my article and see what this author has to say. It seems to me that the strongest evidence against Lucan was the fact that Sandra Rivet, who was murdered, was beaten with a pole, or I suppose a metal club with some tape wrapped around it. And the police claim a similar weapon was found in Lucan's car when it was found abandoned. And that would seem to be the most damning evidence against him. So I'm looking forward to seeing what this book says about that particular piece of evidence, because whoever wrote the lady who wrote this book seems to be quite convinced that Lucan wasn't guilty, and seems to have made a decent case for it based on one of the reviews. So more on that later. But anyway, I know it's an old case, but I think it's quite interesting. They were very quick to name him in the inquiry, but as I said, that's no longer allowed. It will be interesting to see what this book says, and I'll be writing an article on it. As I said, he's been allegedly seen in different parts of the world. There was a claim that he had a number of rich friends. He was quite wealthy, although he lost a lot of his money with gambling, unfortunately. But he had a lot of rich friends, and there was a claim made at one point that his friends were flying the kids down to Africa so he could see them from a distance, not necessarily meet them, but he could see them from a distance. What's interesting is his son claims he's not guilty. That's probably not terribly surprising. That's the eighth Earl now. He claims he's not guilty. Notably, Sandra Rivet's biological son claims he's not guilty, insofar as claims he didn't commit the murder. Sandra Rivet's son claims that he hired a hitman to commit the murder. But if that's the case, that throws out because most of the evidence against him is in relation to him having been there, and his wife, Lord Lucan, claiming he was there. If indeed he wasn't there and he'd hired somebody else, well, okay, present your evidence that that's the case. But most of the evidence against him is predicated on him having been there. So if he wasn't there, none of that really matters. So anyway, it's quite interesting. Apparently, Sandra Rivet's son and Lord Lucan's son actually know each other and are actually reasonably friendly, because they've been involved in this case over a number of decades. There's a lot more to the story, but I'll getting into that in the article, and I'll be mentioning a little bit in the book that's coming up in the Victorian fallacy. So anyway, it's interesting how it's often seen as an open and shut case, but when you dig deeper, you see there's a lot more to it.
Right, you mentioned like you're going to bring it up in the Victorian fallacy. So how does this particularly relate to it in that way? In the Victorian fallacy, context.
Yes, well, I'll be getting onto that a little bit more actually, because some of the other items that I've got there relate to that as well.
Okay.
But the book, of course, covers quite a bit of ground, and in a few cases, I have included items that aren't necessarily tied to the central thesis, but I think they're quite interesting to talk about as well. So
Okay.
there's a number of those that I've actually added in. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons it's taken me so many years to write it. That there's quite a bit of material that it's covering now.
Sure. Okay.
So the other item I have, and this is one of the theses that I put forward in the Victorian fallacy, and I'm also writing an article on this at the moment too. The article's called "A Woman's Right to Choose," and I'm just covering a
Yep.
little bit of the material here. So one of the theses that I put forward in the book is that, so essentially we often hear claims like women didn't work historically. Well, we know that's not true. Obviously, women
Right.
did work historically. Society wasn't well enough to have half the population not working until recently. But you do occasionally hear feminists say something along the lines of, "Oh, occasionally a woman was exceptional enough that she was given an exception."
Occasionally, yeah.
You've heard that, yeah. She was given an exception, and she could be a doctor or whatever it happens to be. Okay, so yeah, you've certainly heard that many times. Feminists mention it.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm basically saying that no, that's not the case, and they're not exceptions. And when you look, you see a lot of women being involved in different areas of life, whether it could be politics in some cases, not always, but the politics or business or whatever. There are all sorts of examples. And one of the other reasons it's taken me so long to write it is because as I was researching it, I kept finding new examples, which I tried to include, and I ended up having to draw a line at one point
Mhm.
and say after anything after this will be in the second edition, because
Yeah.
there were so many examples that I came across where there were so many where I think you can't say they're exceptions anymore. These were just women who were actively involved in various areas of public life
Hmm.
in a time when supposedly feminists will tell you women weren't involved. And I ended up
Yeah.
coming to the conclusion that essentially when women wanted historically to step forward and participate in a particular area, to a large degree, the men around them let them.
Hmm.
Now, I will say that's probably, I think in that's probably predicated on having the ability. So we're talking here about women who had the ability,
Yeah.
and when they did, they were permitted to get involved in that area of life. And there doesn't seem to have been a lot of the cases I've researched, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of a blockage from men at all. If the women were there and they could do the job and they were willing to do the job, the men around them seemed to be quite happy to work with them, and that was it. That was that. And I've got a few examples that I'll
Sure.
here. Okay, if you're feel free to jump in any time.
Of course.
So the first one now, so all the examples I picked here, as I said, this is true whenever I look in different periods of history and around the world. Obviously, some societies we don't have as records that are as complete as others, but where and when I look, I see this sort of trend. But I've picked examples mostly from the 19th and early 20th century here. First one is Mary Shelley, of course, the author of Frankenstein. Now, there were, of course, some women who wrote under male names, but there have also been men who historically have written under women's names, and that continues to happen. But Mary Shelley obviously wrote under her own name, wrote Frankenstein. She was friends with Lord Byron and a number of other well-known authors, and they actually were encouraged each other to write. And Frankenstein was actually written around the same time as another volume of The Vampire, another great English novel, which actually was written during over the same sort of summer break, I believe, with
Hmm.
Lord Byron and other people there. And these were men and women who were getting together, and she was viewed as an equal. And she went off and wrote her novel, and other people who participated in that event where they were all together wrote other novels as well. Uh, Another one, which I think is the other end of the extreme, I suppose, a lady by the name of Antonius Roxa, I suppose, was none other than a cowgirl. She was basically, she worked at the Falkland Islands, I think also South America, and she was just essentially, yeah, she wrangled cattle and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And she lived from 1807 to 1869, so first half roughly of the 19th century in English colony in Falkland Islands. I think she was originally from South America though, and yeah, there doesn't seem to have been any problem. She was just doing her job, right? Because she was willing to do it. and alongside the men.
Yeah.
The next one, born the next year. So again, jump in if you've got any thoughts on any of, yep. Caroline Chisholm, who you probably haven't heard of, but I've certainly heard of her because she's on the Australian $5 bill,
Okay.
Australian $5 note.
I don't know anything about Australia.
No, fair enough. Caroline Chisholm is fairly famous, fairly well-known character here because we all see her on the money. But she actually opened an employment agency for women. And it was actually a free agency too, by the way, but only for women. And she also managed to convince the colonial governor to force unemployed men into the countryside to perform farm labor. So
Okay.
here's a woman, okay, and she's fairly well-to-do, I think. She had the ear of the colonial governor enough to basically convince him to get unemployed men out of the city and into the country where there was a need for labor. But this was based on my notes. This was involuntary. Meanwhile, she has launched an employment agency for women in the colony that was free and only available to women.
Okay.
Yeah. A little bit later, Mary Ann Brown Patton, 1837 to 1861, didn't live very long. I can't recall how she died, but she was actually a commander of an American merchant vessel. So here we are, first half of the 19th century approximately, and she's commanding a merchant vessel. So these are, I think, again, this really speaks to this idea that it's not that the women were restricted from doing it. I think most women probably didn't want to do it, but when women did want to do it, the men around them didn't seem to be put up much of an argument about it and just let them go ahead.
Yeah, especially, and they would be probably competent in that case if they were putting the
Exactly.
work in that. Yeah,
That's right. I think we're
Yes.
talking about women who have got the competence, obviously, not
Mhm.
necessarily exceptional, but they've got the competence, and that's right. And the men around them think they can do it, and let them do it.
So
Another
basically,
Australian, go on.
no. What I was going to say is that this is not a innovative idea, and certainly not a feminist innovation at all. Basically, it's just this idea that women have been able to do this or that or the other.
Exactly.
It's in modern consciousness, it seems like a really groundbreaking kind of a revolutionary way for women can do this too in the 20th
Yeah.
century. So. Yeah.
And this really speaks to something that many of us have criticized feminism for, that feminists will claim that, yeah, like you say, there's this groundbreaking revolutionary idea and women can do it now. It really is, they're really putting women in the past down because they're claiming that the women sort of couldn't do any of this stuff until feminism turned up and freed them and suddenly they were able to do it. But if you really look at the historical record, you see that in many industries, a minority of people working in the industry were women. Most women probably didn't want to work in these industries, but you find that there were women working in them, and the men around them didn't seem to have generally too much of a problem with it.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Now I got a question for you.
Mm.
So was it more around the advent of feminism, like the post mainstreaming of this idea, that we started paying attention to the first woman X, the first woman this, the
Mm.
first woman that?
Mm.
Because
Mm.
we have all these people in these trades and putting in this work, as you say, but it's only in the, like, say, the 20th century where we were that we kind of started paying attention to the first woman this or that or the other. Like we talk about completely ridiculously people like Valentina Tereshkova or something like that, just because she
Mm.
was the first woman in space. But the problem is, like, the more we started paying attention about the first woman in space and such like that, the more their qualifications are kind of lesser than that of a man, because all her experience that she's had was parachuting, is as far as I understand, and she was a member of the Communist Party, so that she has some kind of perks,
Yeah.
for sure. No, I mean, I'm obviously other men were members of the Communist Party to have
Mm.
gone in space too, but you get the idea, right? Like
Mm.
it's like, nobody can just say she was just another person that went into space, but the Soviets had to kind of drive the point home in their progressive idea of, well, we were the first in space. Now we're going to put the first woman in space. We put the first
Yeah.
animal in space, whatever.
And I
So
suppose it is natural because first man in space or first person in space, in most cases, that'll be the men. Well, sorry, I mean, first person achieving something in most cases will have been the men. So obviously, first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, first woman in space. Yeah, Valentina Tereshkova, wasn't it? Yeah. So and Laker, I think first dog in space. I suppose it does matter that we've got these firsts, and there are so many firsts starting in the 19th century, I suppose. So probably, and we've got the ability to record it. So it's probably natural that we do record this sort of thing. By the way, even in recent years, I've surprised people by pointing out, for example, we talk about, say, some of the men who have landed on the moon, and wasn't so long ago. Somebody said, "Oh, who was the first woman on the moon?" I went, "Well, we don't know yet. We might find out soon."
Right, yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
the point
but
I
no,
was trying to make, the point I was
yeah,
trying to make here is that, it's only in recent post-feminist years that we've been really kind of hammering, like, pointing out
yeah.
what the first woman is.
And even
Granted,
it's probably more recently that they've really
yeah,
started to hammer it.
yes,
That's
exactly, yeah,
probably late 20th century, I would say. Yeah,
right, yeah, right, yeah,
yeah.
hmm
So, and yeah, obviously, as I was saying, we do have a lot of firsts in here because there are so many new areas of the end of endeavor that people are engaging in. But yeah, they
yeah,
certainly have started to drive it home, haven't they? And I think probably I would suspect 1980s onwards really started to be something that they would just sort of try to drive in,
hmm
probably overdo a little bit.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So next one on my list, Daisy Bates. So she's 1859 to 1951, Irish Australian journalist and anthropologist. So here we've got this woman in the late 19th century. She was going around and studying the Australian Aborigines, going to remote communities and so forth. Now, obviously, there were a lot of men doing that as well, documenting their culture and so forth. There were a lot of men doing that as well, but here we have a woman who was out there doing it. So. Marie Curie, obviously, very famous. She
Yeah, I was
gets a
about
lot
to
of,
bring that up. Like she
yeah.
gets more credit than her husband Pierre, even though they worked
Does
on the
she
same
ever?
thing.
Does she
They
ever?
earned the same prize as a married couple. So,
Exactly. In fact,
right.
a lot of people think she did all the work on her own, which is the reverse of what they often claim with male scientists, where they say that the men are taking the credit from the women.
Mm,
In a lot of cases, I suspect that isn't the case. Maybe it's happened in some cases, but we've also got the case of Marie Curie, and there are some other cases as well where the contributions of men have been forgotten. Hedy Lamarr, of course, is another one.
yeah,
Hedy
super
Lamarr
smart.
invented Wi-Fi. Sorry, no, she didn't. Hedy Lamarr co-invented a frequency hopping technology along with a man by the name of George Antill, who is largely forgotten. But the feminists will claim she invented Wi-Fi. No, she didn't. Feminists will also claim, slightly more informed feminists will claim that she invented a frequency hopping technology. She co-invented it with a man. And unfortunately for them, it's not the one used in Wi-Fi. That was developed separately.
Got you.
Yeah, it was innovative what they did. George Antle and Hedy Lamarr invented a frequency hopping technology during World War II, so that radio guided torpedoes could not be jammed by Axis ships, but it wasn't implemented. The U.S. Navy decided not to go with the technology, but yeah. But anyway, yeah. So poor old George Antle gets forgotten in that equation,
hmm
as does Pierre Curie, as you say. Now, Pierre died in a car accident, or he was hit by a car on a road, looked the wrong way, and his head may have been in the clouds. Some suggested he often apparently was sort of, head was in the clouds thinking about physics,
mm
and got hit by a car. Unfortunately, she did. Marie Curie was, of course, a lot younger, and she did continue their work after he died. And of course, there was Henri Becquerel as well, who they worked with in Paris and shared one of the Nobel Prizes with. And Henri died. He was quite a bit older, and he also died, I think, due to a radiation-related illness. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
poor.
yeah, he was a big pioneer in radiation, of course, right? I mean,
Exactly, that's
yeah.
right. And of course, they didn't have the understanding of it we have
Oh
now,
yeah.
and so yeah.
hmm
So that's right. Pierre and Henri both get forgotten, and Marie gets to take all the credit. She was much younger than both of them. She was very much a junior scientist, and it is true she did continue the work after they both died. But yeah, they were there for that foundational work.
mm
Uh,
Yeah.
Go on.
No, no, no. I'm just kind of smirking at the idea that she was much more of a junior compared to her to them.
Oh
Um,
yeah, she was about 20 years younger than Pierre. Yeah, she was. She
yeah,
was.
sure,
I think she was a student when he was already a professor.
because the
Yeah.
people going on about how the traditional ways of life were the best ways to do. We've got to go back to the old ways. Are also the same kind of people kind of calling men creeps for going after women that are much younger
Pierre
than them. But
Pierre
it
was a
was
legit
sort of the
man.
norm back then, right?
Yeah, yeah. I
Kind
think
of.
she was in his 20s and he was in his 40s when they got married or something like that. So
Hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
So yeah, Gertrude Bell was an archaeologist, 1868 to 1926. So here we have again an archaeologist. Flora Sanders, 1876 to 1956. Flora Sanders is an interesting character. Actually, I only uncovered her when I was actually researching the book. She actually, I think she was British actually, but she actually served in the Serbian army during World War One and ended up, I think, well, yeah, I don't think she eventually retained the rank of captain, but I think that was after the war. So yeah, there was also another British woman, Caroline Matthews, around the same time, 1877 to 1927. She was a physician, a medical doctor, and also served in the Serbian military. But Flora Sanders was actually like officially a soldier in the military. So, and that was during World War One. And both her and her husband, I believe, were reactivated during World War Two as well. So, um, anyway, that was Flora, obviously. Karen Matthews, the doctor, had died by then. But next one, Amelia Earhart, 1897 to 1937.
I think
Very
everyone
well
knows
known.
this one. Yes.
Exactly, that's right. That's right. She's the first female passenger to cross the Atlantic and the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic. And her and a forgotten co-pilot, Fred Noonan,
Fred
uh,
Noonan.
she-
Yes.
yes, disappeared while attempting to circumnavigate the Earth. So uh, Fred Noonan, so Fred Noonan is often forgotten. There was some research actually just recently. They think they may have found the plane. There was some sort of sonar that kind of, signal that was seen that looks a bit like a plane apparently, and they have been their plane under the water. So but there was some a woman's shoe turned up during World War II, and a British unit went to secure a remote Pacific island. And it's about 400 miles, I think, or 400 kilometers, I should say, from where they were supposed to land their plane when they were on that leg of their journey. And they found a woman's shoe and a skull that they think was a female skull. I think possibly some other bones, and they realized it was probably something to do with Amelia Earhart, and they packed it up and sent it off to a British university in one of the colonies in the Pacific. And I think they may have misplaced the skull or something, but I think we probably have some idea what happened to Amelia Earhart. But it'd be interesting to see if and Fred Noonan. Be interesting to see what happens with the with whether the plane that really is the plane that they found. So anyway, yeah, it's another example where Fred Noonan is often forgotten. He was there as well. Anyway. And Hannah, now I'm probably going to mispronounce Hannah's name. Hannah Reicht, I've always pronounced it, 1912 to 1979. This is a really interesting one, I think. She was a German test pilot during World War II. And again, this is one I had not heard of her before started researching the book. And this is interesting because the Nazis really were about putting women back into the kitchen, right? And it was quite interesting that she was allowed to continue as a test pilot despite this. So again, and this is possibly one of the examples that started to get me thinking down this road. I think the part that I'm proposing that I don't recall, I'm unaware of anybody else proposing, is that when women stepped up and wanted to get involved, the men didn't stand in their way. And I think this is a good example where she was a test pilot, despite the Nazi ideology of women being back in the kitchen and producing, kids for the fatherland. She was obviously capable of being a test pilot, wanted to be a test pilot, and they let her do it. They let her continue doing it. So.
I don't suppose she tested some of the old Messerschmitts.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've just taken a few notes for this. Now, I have researched in a bit more detail. I've actually got an article, like a section in the book on her.
Hmm.
I do have some information on what plane she actually did test.
Hmm.
She was because she was a test pilot before, or she was at least she was a pilot before World War Two.
Right, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
the reason I bring up the Messerschmitts because that was one of the more dangerous things to actually it was one of their most
right,
risky planes. Some of them blew up on the landing pad because they were really
right,
like suicidal machines
right.
practically. So yeah, so I'm just saying, did she test those? I, if such a plane is testable, I don't-
Yeah, I don't know. I'll go look afterwards actually and see which one she was in.
Yeah, sure.
And the final, yeah,
I'm thinking
well,
about the Messerschmitt ME 163s. So,
so was that the little jet? What was one of the? Was that the jet?
well, it's some
Because it
kind
was,
of it's an interceptor aircraft. It's a rocket powered aircraft. It kind
yeah,
of
that's
right,
yes,
right. It kind of used volatile. Well, I don't know about volatile, but really dangerous chemicals to kind of put together. So it's
yes,
really, it's really reckless. One of the more reckless kind of planes that they used. So.
yes. Is that? I think that might be the one that I actually. I'm just actually looking for a picture of it online now.
Yeah.
Uh,
Sorry, this
there
is
is
very
one in the
tangential. It's just
yeah.
when I thought about testing German aircraft, I always think of the Messerschmitt.
Yeah, I don't think she did actually do any of the rocket planes. So the ME 163. Ah, yes, yes, okay. The Messerschmitt ME 163 Comet, right.
The Comet,
So
crazy
there,
Comet. I've
yes,
heard
the
of it.
Comet, that's right, which of course in German is spelled with a K. They actually have one in the National Air and Space Museum in Virginia. So
Oh,
my daughter and I recently visited the National Air and Space Museum. They in Washington D.C. They have two sites. I believe a lot of people don't know this. I think I briefly mentioned this in a previous meeting. There's one in obviously right near the mall in Washington D.C. and there's another one in Virginia. I highly recommend going to the second site in Virginia if you get the opportunity. It's about an hour out of DC on public transport. Well worth it. I felt of the two sites, they were both great, but I felt the more memorable site was actually the one in Virginia. And it's not as well known, and it doesn't require, unlike the site in DC, it doesn't require tickets actually.
mm,
But I said I thought it was a more memorable site. They actually have one there, and we actually saw it, and we both recognised it straight away because yes, we remember that it's really about this little plane. So yes, the ME 163. I don't think she tested that actually. I think it was propeller driven planes that she tested.
yeah.
But yes, that I am well aware. I'd forgotten the name briefly, but I'm well aware of that little plane. And this is the thing, it's something like it flew for 8 or 10 minutes, and then the pilots had to glide it in because it
Hmm.
had run out of fuel, which, from what I understand, with the highly corrosive fuel it was using, that's probably a good thing.
Hmm.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't want to land
Yeah.
one of these things with fuel in it. Yeah, I believe there was a
Oh yeah.
fuel tank next to the pilot's leg and one behind another one behind their back. So you probably wouldn't want to be taking too many rounds in this thing either, or
Oh
you'd have
yeah.
highly
Yeah.
corrosive fuel spraying at you. So
Hmm. Exactly.
yes. Yes, thank you for. I briefly forgotten the name, but yes, there is one in Virginia. I gather it was captured at the end of World War II. Highly recommend going. Lots of other great stuff out there in the site in Virginia, by the way, the National Air and Space Museum, including a shuttle and Concorde, Air France Concorde, and all sorts of stuff. But yeah, the ME 163 was actually a bit of a highlight for me. I took a number of pictures of it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The one in the Aerospace Museum is a bit beaten up. It'd been in battle. I see. If I look at the Wikipedia page, I've got a pretty picture of it. Yeah, the one in
Oh
the
yeah.
Aerospace Museum, you can see it's had a hard life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm.
The last one I've got on my list, and then I've got a couple of other ones I was going to talk about as well. But the last one I've got on my list is sort of being that 19th century, early 20th century, is Susan Mary Gilliam Travers. She was a nurse and an ambulance driver during World War II. And another example of a case of, I think she was with the French military. She stepped up and was willing to drive an ambulance and put herself in dangerous situations. And the French government, comprised mostly of men, have said no problem. And so she's been able to perform that duty. She was born 1909, lived to 2003. So there's a lot of other examples too, but you see that in all areas of life, whether it's the military, whether it's civilian professions like archaeology or anthropology or whatever, in a lot of cases too, government, where in fact monarchies were very willing to have female monarchs, as we've seen in previous centuries. When women stepped up, the men around them, as long as they were capable, pretty much said, "Yeah, no problem, you can do it," which is very much counter to the feminist claim.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was going to mention a few other women. Those are I'd selected just to go through a list of some late 19th century, early 20th century women.
Yeah. That's fine.
But Yeah, but there are a lot of other cases. The trades people
Hmm.
in Europe they were going to, obviously that was generally done through guilds. Guilds
Yes.
accepted women. If you're looking at, say, 16th, 17th century, it wasn't at all unusual for women to be accepted into the guilds and learn a trade. There were female armorers, there were female swordsmiths, and so forth. I've never been able to verify the name, but I have actually read that at one point the Paris Swordsmiths Guild was apparently run by a woman, where the highest guild ranking guild member was actually a woman for a while. So I haven't been able to find her name, but at some stage I would like to find her name.
Hmm.
But there were a lot of women who were obviously in the guilds. They were a minority. But one interesting phenomenon that would happen is that a man and a woman would graduate from the guild, they would marry, and they would start a business together. And what would tend to happen is they would work together. Obviously, they were in the same trade. The man would work full time. The woman would work full time until she got pregnant, and then she would shift to part time, caring for children part time and working part time. Sounds very modern, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, because here's what I've been thinking. Like, if I were a feminist, like, let's entertain the idea that if I were one, I will be put in a conundrum having known this information because
Mm.
I
Mm.
can't say that women have been oppressed, so my narrative is out the window, basically, right? Right, yeah.
Right. Feminists have to maintain women are oppressed, otherwise there's nothing for them to free. Because feminists freed women, they claim, right?
They
But if
claim,
there was
yes.
nothing to free them from,
Hmm.
they couldn't have freed them. So, in order to have claimed to have freed them, there must be something to have freed them from. Thus, they need to be oppressed.
Exactly, yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Right, yeah.
Another example from the Middle Ages, the food services industry, which we might call takeout, or I might call takeaway in Australia, that was dominated by women in
Hmm.
Europe for centuries, just as it is now, by the way. So there are a lot more women working in the food services industry in various roles, and that was the case. And takeout, by the way, was quite common in medieval Europe and so forth. A lot of poorer people didn't even have kitchens in their homes, and they would actually buy prepared food a lot of the time. So, and it was prepared mostly by women who were working, by the way.
Hmm.
I'm actually, I enjoy Game of Thrones. I even like season 8, but that's another argument.
Sure.
Uh, yeah, I even like season. I actually wrote an article on feminists really hated something that happened at the end
I think I
of
know
Game
what
of
you're talking about. I don't really know much Game of Thrones, but I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, there was a female character in Game of Thrones who did something really bad towards the end, without too many spoilers, and feminists absolutely blew their lid over it uh, because they had this woman had been portrayed as doing something very bad. Okay, and I wrote an article where I justified what, but justified basically the storyline, and
Yeah, yeah.
because if you look at it, this character had actually done a bunch of horrible things along those lines all the way through. And her father also had actually tried to do what she ended up doing. So it was actually kind of a closing the narrative. She did something terrible, and her father had actually tried to do it and failed, and she managed to do it. So it was entirely in character for her to do this thing. And as I said, I think it was kind of closing the loop in the narrative because her father had attempted to do it, and that's actually kind of where the story starts. So it was really closing the narrative, and it was entirely in character. Anyway, that's kind of off as a tangent. But during Game of Thrones, while I was watching it, there was a scene set in a market in a city. Okay, nothing
Hmm.
particularly special about it, right? There were very few women selling anything in the market. In fact, I don't think there may have been any. It's been a number of years since I saw this scene, but I don't think there actually were any women selling anything in the market. And that, obviously, it's a fantasy world, but it's meant to be based on medieval Europe broadly.
Sure.
It would have been anachronistic. There would have been women selling in the market. It was very, very common. We know this from European medieval markets. We know it from Renaissance markets. We know it from Norse markets. The women were there in the market selling stuff. It was actually ahistorical is probably a better way to put it. It was ahistorical for Game of Thrones to portray a market where there were no women, because that's probably what they believed is the case, but that's not what was the case. You would have found a lot of women, and you would have found women selling food in any market in Europe in the Middle
Yeah,
Ages.
sure. Right, yeah. Yeah,
So
so yeah.
they were working.
Are there more examples?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I've got lots of examples in the book and so forth. One more, I wanted to go back to one sort of earlier example. Um, I've actually got a biblical example, there's a woman in the Bible by the name of Lydia. Nobody knows what her name was about that, but she's known as Lydia. She was actually, according to the Bible, she was the first, she's the first European to become a Christian in the Bible, and is generally accepted as the first European Christian, right? She actually, I think I said she actually probably came from a city called Lydia, and that's where she got the name.
Oh, okay.
Lydia was either a dye merchant or an agent for a dye merchant, right? Now, don't underestimate this. Being a dye merchant was a big deal. That was like a luxury car salesman today, or something like that. She would have been selling high quality goods. There would be a significant amount of money involved with the sale of these goods. She would have been expected to know, about this product she's selling and so forth. So she either ran the business or she was an agent for someone who ran a business who was doing this, right? She also ran a big house. And of course, that's something that a lot of women did do. And essentially, running the houses was a lot like running a business, because they had various goods that had to be bought brought into the house and purchased and so forth. And it was actually quite a big deal. And she also, and the Bible makes it clear that she ran the house. I think the Bible actually says she had the house, as in she owned the house. So, and this is fairly typical wherever. I'm just giving, I gave a few recent examples, talked a little bit about the Middle Ages. Now, a biblical example, wherever you look, you see this. You see women working, you see women running houses. That was really common, obviously. Back to the Middle Ages, actually, when many nobles would go away, they would often leave their wives in charge of their estates and so forth. And there were a lot of female regents that are documented through the Middle Ages. I wrote an article on it for A Voice for Men, which I showed that at one point, the entire British Isles were being run by women at one point. And at the same time, Spain and Portugal actually had female regents as well. So it was very, very common. A lot of nobles would do it. When they went away on campaign or whatever, they would usually leave their wife to run their estate, and run all their holdings. So this was really common. Obviously, these women were not being oppressed. They were actually there running things and bossing men around, quite frankly.
Oh yeah, exactly. It's I mean, so I'm going to bring up the people other than the feminists, the more modern tradcon kind of people, right? They're always saying that women's place is in the home, and they have to be a stay-at-home mom. So they got the part about the bossing men around consistent enough, but they also claim that women didn't actually do any kind of other work. So in addition to the feminists, this throws a wrench into their whole system as well.
Absolutely, it does.
Right, because they're trying to say women are not expected to work outside the home, but they did.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. This idea that there were women who weren't working outside the home, there were some wealthy women who could afford to do that. But in many cases, as I said, their job, as in a sense, was to run the household, which, if you consider how many staff some of these households had, that's actually quite a bit of work. They might have had 20 staff or more in some cases. So even into the Victorian era and so forth. So that, in a sense, is a job too. But you're absolutely right. The idea of these women who essentially weren't doing anything except a bit of light housework just doesn't stack up against the historical record. So what really happened was, as wealth in society grew, children left the workforce, and then women in the 19th century in the West, and then after that, women started to leave the workforce in the later part of the 19th century. So by you reach the time of the sort of the First World War and then into the Second World War, you've got a lot of women who have left the workforce by then. And then, of course, after that, women started saying, well, we want to go back into the workforce. Well, they said we want to go into the workforce, but in actual fact, it was we want to go back into the workforce, because about 70 or 80 years before, a lot of women had left the workforce. I mean, there were always, as I said, there were a lot of cases where women would split their time and go part-time, and care for children, and also, which is obviously something people do today, care for children and also do work part-time. So in a variety of different roles. Obviously, in the early industrial revolution in England, you had young children being sent off to work, and I don't know if some people seem to think that there might have been women who were packing their 3 or 5 year olds off to work and then going and doing some light housekeeping. No, I'm sorry, no. These women were going to work as well. We talk about needing two income households these days. And then in that period, they needed three, four, five income households to get by. They didn't send their children to work because they wanted to. It's because they needed the money. And they would often all work in the same factory. That wasn't unusual. So mum, dad, and the kids would all get ready in the morning, go off to work in the same factory 6 days a week.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of something. Basically tales on my mother's side of the family, right? Both my parents come from farming, basically. More my father, but uh, my mother's on my mother's side, there was more agricultural stuff as well. So, it was just a way of things at the time, right? Like there were
Sure.
more than just a few kids, uh, and they put in for the housework, and so. Mother was telling me about my grandmother, her mother. Uh, Basically, everybody had to work, right? And they had to kind of basically skip out on school because of it, because everybody was working, even the kids. And
Yes.
right, yeah. My grandma was said to sneak out of work to actually go to school, which was kind of, because to me unthinkable, because I didn't want to go to school. I just wanted
I
to stay
had
home.
well, actually had that. So she actually yeah, they ducked out of work early in order to get
Hmm.
to school. Wow.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That was very common. My own grandfather, one of them left school, I think at 13 because he was needed on the farm
Mhm.
as well. Same thing. I have a lot of farming in my background as well, and same situation. They in that case he was I think and they would tend to I think well it was often at the time kids only had to go to school to about 13, but I think there were lots of cases where they just excused them because they had to. They were needed on the family farm, and they needed
Hmm.
their work, their labour
Yeah,
for the family to survive. So the government would just excuse them or not enforce the laws regarding education
right.
age.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
because they had to.
Mhm.
A very
Exactly.
different time. It was only a couple of generations ago.
Hmm. Right.
Mm.
Yeah. And this, I already mentioned tradcon women, but then there's the men on that side kind of going on about the notion of the patriarchy. They're just completely taking in the feminist notion of patriarchy and
Yes.
alleging support for that patriarchy. We've already debunked, the entire point of our argument is that we debunked the feminist patriarchy
Yeah.
conjecture, right? So,
Mm.
but here we have these men saying that, well, it's patriarchy because, women need to stay at home and stuff. That's the way it's always been. But, and they keep on saying that anthropologists agree on this. Well, no, the anthropologists are whatever they're listening to are wrong. We're talking about how women really did work out there. I'm looking at
Yeah.
you, Dan Sullivan. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the traditional family role that traditional family they're talking about isn't really so traditional. So the
Okay.
traditional family is one in which everybody was working. As you said, almost until recently, at least after the appearance of agriculture, almost everybody was on a farm until only a few generations ago. And the reality was that people on the farm were all would just get stuck in and do what needed to be done, and that meant if it was a family farm, mum, dad, and the kids were all out
Mhm.
working on the farm. The women were obviously if they were pregnant and having kids, they might be part time or whatever, but doing stuff around the house as well. But they were still involved in the farm. And another aspect too that gets lost in this, and then the tradcons, this comes back to something the tradcons talk about as well, is the idea of men not being involved in their children's upbringing. That too is relatively recent because until recently, almost everybody lived where they worked, right?
Mhm.
And if you were men and women were with their kids all day long because they were all working together, right? Or if you go back further into a hunter-gatherer society, the men may have gone off with the boys or the older boys, and they would be with those older boys, and most often the girls would be with the mothers. Now, I've made it clear in my writings that I don't think there was a very clear divide between male and female. I think there was a divide, but it wasn't as clear cut as some anthropologists had claimed. So I think there's growing evidence that women would sometimes hunt, for example, and men certainly gathered when they weren't hunting. That's absolutely clear. So, which meant that fathers were probably spending some time with their daughters as well, and people were spending time with their kids. This idea of men going off to work and not being involved in their kids' lives, it's relatively recent in most cases.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Like I'm really trying to pinpoint how this kind of divide in the perspective started. I wonder if it's coincidental to the notion that women were oppressed by men.
Well, I think in my view, the tradcon see the feminists putting forward these arguments and they perceive that as being advantageous to their position.
Yeah,
And so they adopt those arguments. That's kind of how I feel it or suspect it happened.
sure, right.
Yeah. But they say, oh yes, that works for me, and so they'll adopt that argument, even though they may be opposed to other forms of other aspects of feminism, as we know.
Right, to be sure.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, it's a funny situation. We're obviously rejecting feminism, but also rejecting the trade composition position as well. A lot of our detractors don't ever read the site and don't know that. Yeah,
Absolutely. And we get compared to feminists sometimes.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but
We've
the
covered
guy,
that in a
yeah,
previous episode,
yeah,
actually.
yeah,
Yes.
we did, yeah, right. But because the gynocentrists totally are not comparable to the feminists, right?
No, exactly. That's right. It's gynocentrism on both sides of the aisle. That's right.
Mhm.
Across society. Yep. And if you look at the FAQ on the frequently asked questions on Voice from Men, I make that clear. So,
Right.
yep. So that's all I had. I don't know if did you have any items you wanted to discuss?
Well, um, you had something recently going on about a draft policy in Voice for Men, didn't you?
Yes, it's something I've been researching. There's a lot of different areas I research and put on Wiki for Men. Yes, I did find some interesting resources there. I found a website that was pointed to a website that talks about draft policy, and it does give a little bit more information on a few cases where women are drafted. So there are the two cases I was obviously aware of were Israel, obviously everyone knows that, and Eritrea. Eritrea actually forces women into combat, which Israel doesn't. I don't know if there are any other countries that force women into combat, but there are a few others that have drafted women. But I'm unaware of any cases, except possibly Eritrea, where women are drafted on the same terms as men. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, Eritrea is a bit of a special, is possibly a little bit of a special case in that it has an open-ended draft for men and women, and women certainly, and I think also some men have actually received asylum in Western countries because they've been escaping an open-ended draft in Eritrea. Mm.
Gotcha. Right.
But yeah, so it's an interesting case. Men, when it comes to the draft, men are always, except possibly with the exception of Eritrea, are drafted for longer periods of time. So the terms are different. That's certainly true in Israel, where women are drafted for a shorter period of time and they're conscripted for a shorter period of time and have a lot more exemptions. Interestingly enough, though, Israel's actually cracking down on that. So do you want I'll give you the really quick sort of
Sure.
okay, conscription in Israel. Uh, Israel has a number of recognized ethnic minorities. In general, the ethnic minorities are exempted. So nearly around 20% of the population self-identify as Arab. They are generally exempted from the draft or from the conscription, although they may volunteer for service in the Israel Defense Forces. Jewish men and Jewish women are conscripted. There are a couple of minorities, the Druze and the Circassians, who are both men are conscripted, because in both communities, their leaders actually ask for men to be conscripted on the same basis as Jewish men, although in both cases, women are not conscripted with those minorities. So if you look at Jewish men and women in Israel, Jewish men are conscripted. I think it's about 2.5 years. It's actually been reduced from 3 recently, about 2.5 years, I think, at the moment. Jewish women conscripted normally for about 2 years. However, the exemptions are different. If a woman gets pregnant or has a child, she's exempted. I think you possibly she gets married, but if a woman declares herself to be religious, she is exempted. If a Jewish man is not exempted on the basis of being religious, although if he's actually participating in something called a yeshiva, which is like a study essentially an educational institution, he's exempted. But he has to essentially be working there full time or participating full time. A woman merely has to declare herself to be religious, a Jewish woman in Israel, to be exempted from service in the IDF. However, it's been well known that Israeli women who didn't want to serve have just been ticking the box saying they were religious, right? And this has actually become quite a problem. A lot of Israeli women have got exemptions. And I've read in the last year or two, the Israeli government is cracking down on it now and is starting to look into it. And if they're finding the women, for example, are turning up on Facebook or TikTok or whatever, dressed in miniskirts, that shows they're not religious. And they may have actually committed an offense by saying they're religious on this form, because it's an official form, right? They're claiming they're religious. And religious women would be dressing in very modest clothing with dresses going right down to their ankles and all sorts of other things. And apparently the Israeli government is now digging into some of these cases and catching the women out and saying, no, you're not religious. You're going into the army.
So, is religious a much more different context than just being a Jewish person that's conscripted? Is it more Jewish in
Yes.
terms of heritage in that case? So,
Yeah, a significant, just like in Christian countries where you might, or nominally Christian countries like the United States or Australia or Canada, where they were essentially founded by a bunch of Christians, a lot of the population would either be nominally Christian, would declare themselves Christian but don't really go to church, or would say they're not religious. Right. A lot of the same thing is true in Israel. A lot of Israelis are not religious. They're atheists, although they would call themselves ethnically Jewish. They obviously do serve in the army, and there will be a lot of who might nominally call themselves religious, but don't particularly participate in religious rituals. But in order to, if they declare themselves religious, a woman declaring herself religious is saying, I am active within the Jewish religion and I am participating and I'm following the many rules that are set down. And that includes modest clothing for women. So if the army then goes and looks at these women's public profile and discovers that, they went out on Saturday night to a nightclub in a short skirt, that's a clear indication they're not following religious rules in Israel.
right.
And they can actually, apparently they're cracking down on them, and I believe they're starting to draft them now.
I see.
Yeah, because it got to be such a problem. So many women were doing this. And that was, I mean, I knew about it. I've had a long-standing interest in the Middle East, and I knew about it 20 or 30 years ago, that the fact that the women were doing this. So I was ticking the box saying I'm religious. And that was the end of it. But now apparently it's become such a problem in the last few years that the armies had to start looking into these cases, and at least some of them are getting drafted.
Yeah. Right.
So I mean, Israel's got a problem with draft dodging in other regards as well. There's a significant proportion of population that are getting out of the draft. That's a separate issue. So.
Sure. It's funny because we talk about how men are needed in like the family, right? And how fathers are necessary in a child's life, but we of course don't have any exemptions for them in the draft.
No, exactly. That's right. The bar with which a man will get himself exempted from army service is much higher. There are fewer options and it's a much higher standard for him to get an exemption. And if he does, and if he serves longer in his period of conscription, and he serves longer in the reserves too, in almost all cases. So whereas most women will be released from their reserve duty by their mid-20s, men can serve through to their 40s or 50s. It depends on what branch of the military they're in, but they're typically released sometime in their 40s or 50s from reserve duty. Yeah. So yeah, it's not, Israel does not in any way draft women on the same terms as men. It's very different. So I just thought that was interesting, though, that the Israel Defense Forces is actually cracking down on these women now, because it's become such a problem of women ticking the box, I'm religious, and then going on with their life.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's all. I guess I've got. I guess we can probably dig into conscription another time into more detail, but that's So that's the area of the stuff that I've been looking at most recently.
Absolutely.
In that regard. Do you have anything else?
No, I think I said my pieces throughout the video where I did. So
good, and I think we are going on just about an hour, which we said we'd like to. We went to about an hour tonight, so
yeah, sure.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, let's do that.
Cool.
All right. See ya.
See ya.